For centuries, the pyramids have stood tall, whispering secrets of a forgotten world. The tombs of pharaohs, sealed for thousands of years, have guarded treasures beyond gold and jewels. But what if I told you that the greatest treasure of all isn't a relic, it's hidden in their DNA? Ancient Egypt, home to one of the most mysterious and advanced civilizations in human history. Their engineering defied logic. Their knowledge of the afterlife shaped entire belief systems. But there's one mystery scientists have only just begun to unravel. Who were the ancient Egyptians, really? For decades, people have debated their origins. Some claimed they were a civilization untouched by the outside world. Others believed they were shaped by endless invasions and migrations. But now, thanks to groundbreaking DNA research, we finally have the answer. In 2017, scientists achieved the impossible. They extracted DNA from ancient Egyptian mummies, something many believed was scientifically impossible due to Egypt's scorching heat and mummification chemicals. And when the results came in, they shocked the world. What if I told you that ancient Egyptians were genetically closer to people from the ancient Middle East than to modern-day Egyptians? What if I told you that their DNA has connections to civilizations you'd never expect? And most importantly, how did their genetics change so drastically over time? Today, we're diving deep into the genetic legacy of one of the most powerful civilizations ever. Why is ancient Egyptian DNA so unique? Let's find out. DNA. It's more than just a biological code. It's a time machine, a blueprint that carries the echoes of civilizations long gone. Every strand of DNA is a story, one that stretches back thousands of years, connecting us to the people who walked this earth before us. For the ancient Egyptians, their DNA wasn't just a random mix of genes. It was the genetic fingerprint of a civilization that shaped history itself. But for centuries, we could only guess where they came from, who they were, and how they evolved. Historians relied on hieroglyphs, monuments, and artifacts, piecing together a picture of their lives. But there was one missing piece: the people themselves. Their bones, their blood, their genetic story. What if science could reach beyond history books and pull back the veil on who the ancient Egyptians truly were? DNA is the key. It can trace migration patterns, ancestry, and even the genetic influences of war, trade, and empire building. With every new discovery, we rewrite the past, sometimes in ways that challenge everything we thought we knew. But here's the problem. Egypt's searing desert heat and ancient embalming methods made DNA extraction nearly impossible. For years, scientists believed that mummies, despite being perfectly preserved on the outside, held no usable DNA inside. That is, until now. What happened next was nothing short of a scientific breakthrough. In 2017, for the first time in history, researchers unlocked the genetic code of ancient Egypt, directly from the bodies of the pharaohs themselves. And what they found was beyond shocking. Who were the ancient Egyptians? Were they isolated, or were they connected to the rest of the world? And why does their DNA look so different from modern Egyptians? The answers are about to shake the foundations of history. For years, it was a scientific dead end. Ancient Egyptian mummies had survived for thousands of years, intact, wrapped, and preserved. But inside, their DNA was believed to be too damaged, too degraded, too far gone to ever be recovered. Egypt's harsh desert heat, the chemicals used in mummification, the passage of time itself, all of it made scientists believe that extracting genetic material from mummies was impossible. Even when attempts were made, the results were dismissed as contaminated, unreliable, or outright failures. But then, everything changed. In 2017, a team of geneticists, archaeologists, and forensic experts set out to achieve what no one had done before: extract pure, uncontaminated DNA from ancient Egyptian mummies. They didn't rely on old methods. Instead, they bypassed the soft tissue, which was often compromised, and went straight to the bones and teeth, the most protected parts of the human body. One by one, they carefully drilled into the remains, retrieving genetic material hidden inside for thousands of years. Then came the real challenge: separating ancient DNA from modern contamination. Scientists used cutting-edge sequencing technology to filter out every trace of modern human interference, ensuring that what they were seeing was 100% authentic. And after years of failed attempts, setbacks, and skepticism, it worked. For the first time in history, researchers held the true, unaltered DNA of ancient Egyptians in their hands. 90 mummies from Middle Egypt, spanning 1,300 years of Egyptian history, had finally given up their genetic secrets. But the real shock came when they compared it to modern Egyptians, because the results were not what anyone expected. Ancient Egyptian DNA wasn't most closely related to modern-day Egyptians. It wasn't even closest to other African populations. Instead, their genes pointed to an entirely different ancestry, one that rewrote history in real time. What did the scientists find? And what does it reveal about who the ancient Egyptians truly were? The answers are mind-blowing. And then, the results came in. After years of failed attempts, for the first time in history, scientists had finally decoded the genetic blueprint of ancient Egyptians. But what they discovered sent shockwaves through the world of archaeology and genetics. Because ancient Egyptian DNA did not match what many had assumed for decades. It didn't point south towards sub-Saharan Africa. It didn't even align perfectly with modern Egyptians. Instead, their closest genetic relatives were found thousands of miles away, across the deserts and seas, in the ancient lands of the Near East. Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Turkey, even parts of Europe. This was a revelation. It meant that the ancient Egyptians, one of the most influential and powerful civilizations in history, shared more genetic similarities with Neolithic farmers from Anatolia and the Levant than with modern Egyptians today. How was this possible? And what did it mean for everything we thought we knew about Egypt's past? For centuries, Egypt was the beating heart of an interconnected world, a land of trade, conquest, and migration. Their genetic ties to the Near East weren't random. They were the result of thousands of years of movement, mixing, and influence. From as early as 10,000 years ago, people from the Levant, modern-day Israel, Syria, and Turkey, had already begun moving into North Africa, bringing agriculture, technology, and culture with them. This genetic link grew stronger over time as Egypt became a hub for trade, diplomacy, and war. The Hyksos, a mysterious group from the Levant, ruled Egypt for over a century, bringing new customs and warfare techniques. Phoenician traders from Lebanon left their mark on Egyptian markets and society. Persians, Greeks, and Romans ruled Egypt at different times, bringing waves of settlers and reshaping the population. Egypt wasn't isolated. It was a crossroads of civilization, absorbing and influencing the world around it. But if ancient Egyptians were so genetically connected to the Near East, why do modern Egyptians look different today? Something had changed, something that rewrote Egypt's genetic landscape forever. The answer lies in a massive genetic shift that took place within the last 2,000 years. A shift that would introduce a new wave of ancestry into Egypt, forever altering its genetic makeup. What happened? And how did modern Egyptians end up with a different genetic profile than their ancestors? The answer is coming next. For thousands of years, the genetic makeup of ancient Egyptians remained remarkably consistent, closely tied to the people of the Near East. But something changed. Today, modern Egyptians carry a noticeably higher percentage of sub-Saharan African ancestry. This shift wasn't sudden. It was the result of thousands of years of migrations, invasions, and cultural transformations that rewrote Egypt's genetic landscape forever. It all began with trade. Egypt was always a hub for commerce, but as the Greco-Roman world expanded, Egypt became a gateway between Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Merchants, sailors, and traders flowed in and out of Egyptian ports, bringing not just goods but also people. Caravans from deep within Africa moved along trans-Saharan routes, carrying gold, ivory, and spices, but also carrying new populations into Egypt. Over time, these interactions led to the gradual mixing of peoples. Then came the Arab expansion in the 7th century CE. When Islam spread across North Africa, Egypt became a crucial center of the Islamic world. Arab settlers arrived, intermarried with local Egyptians, and left a lasting genetic impact. The population of Egypt became even more diverse, blending Middle Eastern and African ancestry over generations. This wasn't just a cultural shift, it was a biological one, shaping the DNA of modern Egyptians in ways never seen before. But the biggest factor in this genetic transformation was the trans-Saharan slave trade. Over the course of 1,000 years, an estimated 6 to 7 million people from sub-Saharan Africa were transported northward, many settling in Egypt and integrating into local society. Unlike in some regions, where enslaved populations remained separate, In Egypt they were absorbed into the general population over generations. This led to an undeniable increase in African genetic markers in modern Egyptians, one of the most significant shifts in their ancestry since ancient times. European colonial influences also played a role, though to a much smaller extent. The Ottoman Empire, followed by French and British rule, introduced another layer of genetic diversity. However, the core of Egypt's genetic identity remained deeply tied to its ancient past. Despite all these changes, modern Egyptians still share a strong ancestral link to their forebears. Their DNA has evolved, but the genetic fingerprints of the pyramid builders still remain. But if ancient Egyptians were so closely related to the Near East, what does that mean for their royal bloodlines? Were the pharaohs different from the common people? And what do the DNA results of famous figures like Ramesses III and Tutankhamun tell us? The answers might change everything. When scientists first began unlocking the genetic secrets of ancient Egypt, they didn't just study the general population. They went straight to the heart of its most powerful figures. The pharaohs, rulers believed to be the living embodiment of gods, were now under the scrutiny of modern science. But what researchers discovered in the DNA of some of Egypt's most famous kings sparked controversy, debate, and more questions than answers. In 2012, a groundbreaking study analyzed the DNA of Ramesses III, one of Egypt's last great warrior pharaohs. His reign was marked by brutal battles, political intrigue, and a dramatic assassination attempt. But when geneticists sequenced his Y chromosome, the result was unexpected. Ramesses III carried haplogroup E1b1a, a lineage most commonly found in Central and West Africa today. This single discovery ignited debates about the genetic diversity of Egypt's ruling class. Did Egypt's royalty have different origins than the general population? Or was Egypt's genetic history far more complex than we had assumed? Then came the biggest revelation of all, the genetic analysis of Tutankhamun, the boy king whose untouched tomb stunned the world in 1922. In 2020, researchers revisited the DNA of Tutankhamun and his family, revealing that his Y-DNA belonged to haplogroup R1b, a lineage most commonly found in Eurasia. This stark contrast to Ramesses III led to even more speculation. Did different dynasties have different genetic origins? Were Egypt's rulers part of shifting power structures influenced by migrations and external influences? Some studies questioned the accuracy of these findings, arguing that contamination or methodological flaws could have skewed the results. Others pointed out that a single genetic haplogroup doesn't tell the whole story of an individual's ancestry. But one thing became clear: Egypt's royal bloodlines were anything but simple. The DNA of these famous pharaohs hinted at something much bigger. Egypt was never an isolated kingdom. It was a crossroads of civilizations, a place where genetics, culture, and power constantly shifted. The ruling class may have had different ancestries across various dynasties, reflecting the influences of trade, conquest, and foreign rule. But if pharaohs carried genetic markers from different regions, what about the rest of the population? Could Egypt's DNA reveal hidden connections to other great civilizations? And how does ancient Egyptian DNA compare to that of other historical cultures? The answers are coming next. For centuries, Egypt has been seen as a world apart, a civilization so advanced, so mysterious, that it seemed almost separate from the rest of history. But DNA tells a different story. Ancient Egyptians were not an isolated people. Their genes reveal deep, undeniable connections to other great civilizations, proving that Egypt was a genetic bridge between Africa, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe. When scientists mapped out the DNA of ancient Egyptians, they discovered striking similarities with Neolithic farmers from the Levant, the region that includes modern-day Israel, Jordan, and Syria. This wasn't a coincidence. Thousands of years before the pyramids were built, early humans migrated from the Near East into North Africa, bringing agriculture, language, and new technologies with them. These migrations left a permanent genetic imprint, shaping the foundation of Egyptian civilization. But the connections didn't stop there. As Egypt grew into a powerful empire, its people mixed with traders, conquerors, and settlers from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and even southern Europe. The Hyksos, a mysterious group from the Near East, took control of Egypt for over a century. The Phoenicians, legendary seafarers from Lebanon, brought their influence to Egyptian markets. The Persians, Greeks, and Romans all ruled Egypt at different times, leaving behind not just their culture but their DNA as well. And then there was Nubia, Egypt's southern neighbor. For thousands of years, Egypt and Nubia shared a complex relationship, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, but always connected. Trade, intermarriage, and even dynastic rule meant that Nubian DNA mixed with Egyptian bloodlines. Some scholars believe that entire royal dynasties, including the powerful 25th dynasty, may have had significant Nubian ancestry. This genetic mixing wasn't just one-sided. The ancient Egyptians themselves were travelers, traders, and explorers. Egyptian artifacts have been found as far away as Mesopotamia, Greece, and even Afghanistan. The legendary Queen Tai, the grandmother of Tutankhamun, may have had connections to the lands beyond Egypt's borders, further proving how interconnected the ancient world really was. But despite all these genetic influences, something remarkable happened. Egypt maintained its unique identity for over 3,000 years. While other civilizations rose and fell, while empires crumbled and vanished, Egypt endured. Its people absorbed influences from the outside world, but the core of their civilization remained intact. However, this raises a critical question. If Egypt's DNA tells a story of constant interaction with the world, how do we know that the results of these genetic studies are even accurate? Could modern contamination or flawed methodologies be distorting the true picture of ancient Egyptian ancestry? The challenges of studying ancient DNA are immense, and the controversy surrounding it is even bigger. That's coming next. Unlocking the DNA of ancient Egyptians wasn't just a scientific breakthrough. It was a battle against time, contamination, and centuries of skepticism. For years, experts believed that recovering authentic genetic material from Egyptian mummies was impossible. The intense desert heat, high humidity, and chemicals used in mummification were thought to destroy DNA beyond repair. Even the first attempts to extract mummy DNA in the 20th century were dismissed as unreliable, contaminated by the modern world. Then came the 2017 study that changed everything. Scientists used next-generation sequencing and advanced decontamination techniques to isolate pure ancient DNA from the bones and teeth of mummies. Instead of relying on soft tissues, which were more likely to be compromised, they extracted genetic material from the inner layers of bones, where DNA was better preserved. They then ran extensive contamination tests, filtering out any modern genetic interference. The result? A verified genetic profile of ancient Egyptians, revealing their close ties to the Near East and minimal sub-Saharan African ancestry, at least in earlier periods. But not everyone was convinced. Almost immediately, the study faced criticism. Some researchers argued that the sample size was too small. The study focused on just 90 mummies from one site in Middle Egypt, which may not represent the entire ancient population. Others pointed out that Egypt's genetic landscape was vast and complex, varying greatly between Lower Egypt, North, Middle Egypt, and Upper Egypt, South. Could it be that southern Egyptians had a different genetic profile, one that included more African influence? And if so, did this mean the results were only telling part of the story? Another major concern was the selection of comparison groups. Critics argued that some studies used modern West African populations as a genetic reference for sub-Saharan ancestry, rather than populations from the Horn of Africa or the Nile Valley, which might have been a better match for ancient Egyptian genetics. This choice could have led to an underestimation of African genetic influence in ancient samples. There were also questions about historical biases. Some scholars warned that DNA studies should not be used to push political or racial narratives about Egypt's past. Over the years, various groups have tried to claim ancient Egypt as exclusively Middle Eastern, African, or even European, despite its long history as a multi-ethnic civilization. Could the results of genetic studies be misinterpreted or misrepresented to fit modern agendas? Despite these controversies, most experts agree on one thing: ancient DNA studies are still in their early stages, and Egypt's genetic history is far from fully understood. Future discoveries, especially from southern and pre-dynastic sites, could add new layers to this complex puzzle. The debate is far from over, but one thing is certain: DNA has given us a new lens to study ancient history, revealing secrets that were once thought lost forever. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating questions of all. What did ancient Egyptians actually look like? Could DNA tell us about their skin color, eye color, or physical traits? And do modern Egyptians still carry those same features today? The answers are coming next. For centuries, artists, Historians and filmmakers have painted their own pictures of ancient Egyptians. Some have imagined them with olive-toned skin and sharp Middle Eastern features, while others have depicted them as dark-skinned with deep African characteristics. But what does science say? Can DNA finally reveal how the people who built the pyramids actually looked? The answer lies in genetic markers, specific segments of DNA that determine physical traits like skin color, hair texture, and eye color. When scientists analyzed the DNA of ancient Egyptians, they found something fascinating. Many of them carried a mutation in the SLC24A5 gene, which is strongly linked to lighter skin pigmentation. This same mutation is found at high frequencies in Neolithic farmers from Anatolia and the Levant, further supporting the idea that ancient Egyptians had deep genetic ties to the Near East. But lighter skin doesn't necessarily mean pale or European-like. It simply means that, on the genetic spectrum, ancient Egyptians may have had a bronze, sun-kissed complexion, darker than modern Middle Easterners but lighter than many sub-Saharan Africans. A true intermediate tone, reflecting their position at the crossroads of Africa and the Middle East. Their eye color was also revealing. Unlike the dramatic blue-eyed pharaohs often depicted in movies, DNA suggests that dark eyes were overwhelmingly dominant in ancient Egypt. The HER2 gene, which influences eye color, was found in its ancestral form, meaning most ancient Egyptians likely had brown or dark hazel eyes. Hair texture is harder to determine from ancient DNA, but historical artwork provides clues. Wall paintings and sculptures often depict Egyptians with wavy or curly hair, sometimes styled in elaborate braids. The presence of the EDAR gene, common in many ancient populations of the Middle East and North Africa, suggests that their hair type ranged from loose waves to tight curls, a perfect reflection of their mixed heritage. But what about modern Egyptians? Do they still resemble their ancestors? The answer is yes and no. While modern Egyptians have absorbed additional genetic influences over the last 2,000 years, their core genetic identity remains largely intact. Many Egyptians today, especially in rural areas, still share facial structures, skin tones, and features seen in ancient depictions. However, due to increased African, Arab, and even European admixture, the diversity of modern Egyptians is greater than ever before. The key takeaway: ancient Egyptians weren't a monolithic group. Just like today, their appearance varied across different regions. Those in Lower Egypt, north, likely had features closer to their Levantine neighbors, while those in Upper Egypt, south, may have had stronger Nubian influences. Egypt wasn't just a kingdom, it was a vast, multi-ethnic empire where diversity was the norm, not the exception. So while the debate over their exact appearance may never fully end, one thing is clear: ancient Egyptians looked like themselves. They weren't fully African, fully Middle Eastern, or fully European. They were uniquely Egyptian, a civilization like no other. But now comes the biggest question of all. What does this mean for history? And how does understanding ancient Egyptian DNA change the way we see the world today? That's coming next. For centuries, we've looked at ancient Egypt through the lens of monumental architecture, exquisite art, and the written records of pharaohs and priests. But now, DNA is giving us a new perspective, one that reshapes our understanding of history, culture, and identity. Discovering that ancient Egyptians were genetically closer to the people of the Near East than to modern Egyptians challenges long-held beliefs about the region's history. It suggests that Egypt was always part of a larger interconnected world, where borders were porous and cultures blended freely. This new genetic evidence reinforces the idea that Egypt's greatness wasn't built in isolation. It was the result of constant exchange and influence from surrounding civilizations. This interconnectedness can be seen in every aspect of ancient Egyptian life. Their writing system, for example, shares similarities with ancient scripts from Mesopotamia. Their art and architecture, while uniquely Egyptian, also show traces of Greek, Persian, and even Nubian influence. The pharaohs themselves forged alliances through marriage with foreign princesses, creating a web of political and genetic connections that span continents. But this discovery also speaks to the resilience of Egyptian culture. Despite waves of conquerors, Hyksos, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the core of Egyptian identity remained strong. Their religion, their language, and their traditions survived through millennia, adapting yet enduring. DNA shows us that while their genes may have mixed, their cultural DNA, the essence of what it meant to be Egyptian, remained unbroken. Modern Egyptians, carrying traces of ancient DNA, are living proof of this unbroken lineage. They are the heirs of a civilization that influenced the world and continues to capture our imagination. Understanding this deep genetic connection doesn't just tell us where Egyptians came from. It tells us how we're all connected, how human history is a shared story of movement, interaction, and evolution. By studying ancient DNA, we aren't just uncovering the past. We're learning about ourselves, our shared heritage, and the ways our ancestors shaped the world we live in today. History isn't set in stone. It's written in our genes, constantly evolving as we uncover more about where we come from. As scientists continue to decode the secrets of ancient DNA, one thing is clear. There are still countless stories waiting to be told, hidden in the strands of our ancestors. The journey has just begun, and who knows what other mysteries lie buried beneath the sands of time. If you found this journey through ancient genetics fascinating, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. And drop a comment below. What do you think about the surprising genetic connections of ancient Egypt? Let's keep this conversation going.